Though an uneasy ceasefire between Israel and Iran continues to hold, just a few days ago on June 24th, the Iranian parliament threatened the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. But this wasn't the first time that Hormuz, which is situated at the narrowest point of the Persian Gulf, has turned into a flashpoint between Iran and the West. Since at least 1300 CE, Hormuz has been the hinge of Eurasian trade, where thousands of Indians, Arabs, Iranians, Mongols and Turks made their fortunes. Goods poured through Hormuz to and fro the Mediterranean, West and Central Asia, South and Southeast Asia and China. But in the 16th century, the Portuguese adventurer Alfonso de Albuquerque took control of the port. The shockwave rippled through the Western Indian Ocean, and the decades after saw the end of Hormuz's prominence, the development of Iran's first maritime policy, and the immigration of tens of thousands of Indian traders and investors into the Gulf and Iran. This is the story of how Hormuz shaped the history of India and the history of the world. Just as the Gulf's geography offered opportunities throughout time, it also created challenges. Its character was completely unique, nothing like our world of monolithic nation-states. Sam Dalrymple, historian and author of Shattered Lands, The Five Partitions of India, described Gulf towns to me as trading islands or oasis towns wedged between the sand sea and the salt sea. They make less sense as states and more as oases filled with traders. Their population was never consistent, it waxed and waned with the trading seasons, which in turn depended on the monsoon. Now, outside these ports in the Gulf, weather conditions were extreme. Storms, unseasonal winds, scorching heat and humidity. The northern edge of the Gulf was shielded from the Iranian plateau by a mountain range, which allowed little room for coastal states to grow. On the south, the vast Arabian desert was home to small tribes that occasionally preyed on sea traffic. Hormuz rose to prominence because it was able to offer safe ground for international trade without the risk of piracy. This wasn't what you'd expect from looking at it. Barely a few kilometers across, sweltering Hormuz was encrusted in salt with only one freshwater source. Its rulers solved this problem by importing water on barges from the shore. Markets were kept open all night to avoid the daytime heat. In the Persian Gulf, a political and economic history of 5 port cities, historian Willem Floor further explains that the rulers of Hormuz imposed an embargo on timber, ores, coir, iron and steel, which prevented their rivals from building ships. They then took control of nearby ports, establishing a chokehold on the Gulf. Though Hormuz's rulers were Muslim, the island made no segregations on ethnic or religious lines. The second largest group on the island were Indians, who conducted a roaring trade in horses in the 13th century CE. In India's sea trade with Iran in medieval times, historian Shireen Musvi discusses the Somanatha Veeraval inscription, recording the construction of a mosque in Somnath in 1264 by the Hormuz merchant Anirudh Kanisetti. The Sanskrit portion of the inscription describes the mosque as a dharmasthana and mentions the direct involvement of Gujarat's ruling Chalukya king and his officials in the grant. If this Hormuz merchant had such influence, according to Musvi, quote, Hormuz merchants must surely have formed an elite group of some importance in the Chalukya kingdom of Gujarat. Now, for the next century, Hormuz continued to flourish. According to Musvi, Hormuz's networks extended as far as Uzbekistan and Turkey. Goods shipped from Hormuz reached in relays all the way to China, and the Chinese admiral Cheng He brought his vast armada there multiple times in the 15th century, where he exchanged ceramics and silks for the luxuries of Western Eurasia. Strategic resources such as horses were shipped to India from Hormuz. In return, India provided necessities such as rice to the Gulf ports, as well as luxuries like cloth, metals, woods and spices. In the edited volume India and the Indian Ocean, Professor Michael Pearson notes that exchanges overwhelmingly favored India. Vast quantities of silver and salt were required to balance the trade. Now, in the early 1500s, something changed. The Portuguese erupted into the Indian Ocean. From their galleons, which were artillery platforms designed for deep sea and coastal voyaging, they attempted to take control of trade gateways in the Indian Ocean, including Hormuz. They stationed a permanent garrison on the island in 1515, but immediately ran into problems. The Portuguese made completely unrealistic tribute demands on Hormuz's rulers. This quickly led to a backlash, forcing them to replace the rulers and play a balancing game between factions. Initially, the Portuguese were simply not numerous enough to really change the patterns of Indian Ocean trade. Their Bania partners in the port of Diu continued to export cloth and spices to Hormuz, and Portuguese ships had mostly Muslim crews. But Musavi notes that Portuguese official extortions eventually made costs too unreasonable. At the same time, the Mughal Empire of the Indian subcontinent consolidated its reach into Afghanistan. Conquering Kandahar, the Mughals stabilized overland routes from India to Central Asia, which further weakened the appeal of Hormuz. The Ottoman Empire, which controlled Iraq, attempted to get rid of the Portuguese in 1552, but failed. It would be an Iranian power which finally expelled them and restored some normalcy to the Gulf trade, but Hormuz would never again be independent. Up to this point, riven by internal strife, the Safavid dynasty of Iran had paid little attention to events in Hormuz, though they were technically its overlords. But Shah Abbas I, a contemporary of the Mughal Emperor Jahangir, eventually consolidated power. He was alarmed by the loss of both Kandahar and Hormuz, which were crucial to Iran's trade with the steppe and the ocean. In the Gulf in the 17th century, historian Abdul Aziz M. Awad describes how in 1622, Abbas I used a mixture of threats and promises to convince the English East India Company to attack Hormuz on his behalf. This was successful, and the Portuguese stranglehold was finally broken. Simultaneously, Abbas recaptured Kandahar from Mughals, re-establishing Iran as a major economic player. Now, Abbas had learned from the mistakes of earlier Gulf rulers. If allowed to rule Hormuz Island, European sea power was impossible to challenge in the strait. And so Abbas routed Gulf trade into a tiny mainland port called Gombrun, which he renamed Bandar Abbas, or Abbas Port. He also encouraged the immigration of Indian merchants throughout Iran in unprecedented numbers. According to Professor Floor, about a third of all homes in Bandar Abbas belonged to Indians. There was a large temple and Hindu processions were taken out. The Baniyas also paid the Persian authorities to ban public cow slaughter. Historian Scott Levi, in his paper The Indian Merchant Diaspora in Early Modern Central Asia and Iran, writes that 12,000 Indian merchants reside in Isfahan, the capital of Safavid Iran. These merchants traded primarily in cloth and luxury commodities, but used the proceeds for investments and money lending. As such, they were really favored by Iranian authorities. They, and I quote, provided a considerable source of income for the treasury, facilitated taxation by extending a monetized economy into the countryside, and provided village craftsmen and farmers with an important source of investment, capital, and credit services. But this didn't automatically imply good relations between Safavid Iran and Mughal India. In the beginning of this video, we talked about how Gulf ports like Hormuz conducted their own business in the 1300s, but by the 1600s they had become chess pieces wielded by gunpowder empires. But some patterns were deeper than the transient politics of states. Indian immigration to the Gulf continued over the centuries. As the East India Company and then the British Raj expanded through the Gulf, their officials noted again and again the ubiquity of Indians. Thomas Herbert, writing in 1627 to 1630, claimed that they, and I quote, swarm through the Orient, pursuing trade in infinite numbers. Indians in general, not just Baniyas, worked as shopkeepers, brokers, bankers, accountants, translators, and secretaries. Indian craftsmen and laborers made up a huge proportion of the economy of Oman in the 17th century, and Indian soldiers traveled via the Gulf to fight British battles in the First World War. As Sam Dalrymple writes, it was very much possible in the early 20th century that Gulf states could have joined an independent India. Even after the partitioning of the Indian Ocean world into nation-states, Indians continue to work and live in all echelons of Gulf society. The Straits of Hormuz once made Indian fortunes, both before and after the era of powerful states that looked to the sea. Now, what will happen if tensions rise again and they are closed? Aditya Ramanathan, a research fellow at the Takshila Institution, told me about 20% of oil and natural gas consumed across the world flows through the Strait of Hormuz. Even if ships heading to India aren't blocked, a major disruption in Hormuz will likely cause energy prices to spike up and make it hard to insure vessels. In a time of economic uncertainty, the last thing India wants is an oil shock. Now, the Gulf and the Indian seaboard are not perhaps as close as they once were, but they will always be interlocked. If you have questions or comments, we'd love to hear them. Follow us everywhere on social media. You can find me on Instagram at Anirudh and on Twitter at Kanisetti. We'll see you next week.